October 8th, 1941. The grand boulevards of Moscow, Russia. A cold, unrelenting rain turns the city streets into rivers of grey sludge, as Major Marina Raskova stares out the window of her office at the Zhukovsky Air Force Academy. The glass rattles rhythmically, not from the wind, but from the distant, thunderous concussions of German artillery pounding the outer defensive lines less than 100 miles away. Inside the room, the air is thick with stale cigarette smoke and the smell of damp wool, yet Raskova hardly notices the suffocating atmosphere. Her eyes focus intently on a towering stack of crumpled letters resting on her mahogany desk, representing hundreds of desperate pleas written by young women who refuse to stand idly by while the Wehrmacht threatens to swallow their capital city. The situation facing the Soviet Union in the autumn of that year was nothing short of catastrophic. Operation Barbarossa, the massive German invasion launched just months prior, had decimated the Red Army and obliterated thousands of Soviet aircraft before they could even leave the tarmac. Panic was beginning to grip the highest levels of the Kremlin as Nazi tank divisions tore through the western territories with terrifying speed and precision. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies, raining fire upon retreating columns of soldiers and terrified refugees alike. In this moment of existential dread, the Soviet leadership realized they were running out of time, equipment, and most critically, they were running out of men to pilot the few remaining machines of war. Marina Raskova was not merely an observer of this unfolding tragedy, but a national icon who possessed the unique leverage to change the course of history. As a famous navigator who had set world records for long-distance non-stop flights in the 1,930 seconds, she was the Soviet equivalent of Amelia Earhart and a hero of the Soviet Union. Her fame granted her a direct line of communication to Joseph Stalin, a privilege few dared to exercise during such volatile times. Raskova knew that the letters on her desk were not just fan mail but a mobilized force waiting to be unleashed. These women, many of whom were skilled civilian pilots from local flying clubs, were demanding the right to fight and die for their motherland alongside their fathers and brothers. Raskova gathered the correspondence and marched through the heavily guarded corridors of the Kremlin to present her case to the Soviet dictator. She argued with fierce determination that Russian women had already proven themselves capable in other sectors and that their patriotism was a resource the military could no longer afford to squander. Stalin, initially skeptical of the idea of women in combat, could not ignore the grim reality of the casualty reports piling up on his own desk. The desperation of the moment forced his hand, leading him to authorize the formation of 3 all-female aviation regiments. On October 8, 1941, Order number 0099 was officially signed, setting in motion a military experiment that the world had never seen before. News of the recruitment drive spread through the streets of Moscow and across the radio waves like wildfire. Thousands of young women, ranging from university students to factory workers, flocked to the recruitment centers with a mixture of naive excitement and steely resolve. The hallways of the recruitment offices became a chaotic sea of colorful dresses and high heels as the applicants jostled for position. Many of these volunteers were barely out of their teenage years, some as young as 17, yet they lied about their ages or used their connections to bypass the strict requirements. They were not looking for glory or adventure, but were driven by a burning desire to avenge the destruction of their homes and the deaths of their loved ones. Among the throngs of aspiring aviators stood future legends like Nadezhda Popova and Yevdokia Bershanskaya, women whose names would soon be whispered with fear by German soldiers. The selection process was brutal and swift, as Raskova and her staff had to whittle down the thousands of applicants to a few hundred of the most promising candidates. They were looking for navigators, pilots, mechanics, and armaments officers who could handle the physical and mental strain of total war. The interviewers tested their knowledge of aviation theory and their psychological stability, often asking harsh questions to see if the girls would break under pressure. Those who passed the initial screening were told to pack their bags immediately, for there was no time for proper goodbyes. The departure from Moscow took place on October 16, a day that would later be known historically as the Great Panic. The German army was practically at the gates of the city, and the government was in the process of evacuating to the east. The selected women gathered at the Kazan railway station, surrounded by a swirling mass of terrified civilians trying to board any train leaving the capital. The air was filled with the screams of separated families and the shrill whistles of steam engines preparing to depart. Raskova's recruits, still wearing their civilian clothes and carrying small suitcases, pushed their way through the mob to reach the designated train that would take them to their training grounds in Engels, a town located on the Volga River. The journey to Engels was a grueling introduction to the hardships of military life that awaited them. The women were packed into unheated cattle cars that smelled of livestock and rust, with barely enough room to sit, let alone sleep. As the train chugged slowly eastward away from the front lines, the temperature inside the cars dropped well below freezing. They shared what little food they had brought with them, huddled together for warmth under thin blankets, and sang patriotic songs to drown out the rhythmic clanking of the wheels. This shared misery forged an immediate bond among the recruits, transforming a group of strangers into a sisterhood that would prove essential for their survival in the months to come. Upon their arrival at the Engels School of Aviation, the reality of their situation began to sink in with sobering clarity. The airfield was a desolate expanse of snow-covered flatland, whipped by biting winds that cut through their civilian coats. They were marched to the barracks, which were little more than wooden shacks with minimal insulation against the encroaching Russian winter. Raskova wasted no time in stripping away their civilian identities to mold them into soldiers of the Red Army. The women were ordered to cut their hair short, a traumatic experience for many who viewed their long braids as a symbol of their femininity. There were no barbers, so they took turns hacking at each other's hair with dull scissors, often resulting in jagged and uneven cuts. The distribution of uniforms provided a moment of grim comedy amidst the harsh conditions of the camp. The military logistics system had no supply of women's clothing, so the recruits were issued standard men's tunics, trousers, and heavy greatcoats that were several sizes too large. The women looked ridiculous as they wrapped the excess fabric around their waists and rolled up their sleeves to find their hands. The boots were the worst offenders, often size 42 or 43, swallowing their smaller feet and making marching a clumsy, stumbling ordeal. To cope, they stuffed the toes of the boots with old newspapers or rags to prevent blisters and to keep their feet from sliding around inside the cavernous leather. Despite the ill-fitting gear and the skepticism of the male instructors at the base, the training schedule was implemented with ruthless efficiency. Raskova informed them that they would be expected to complete a 3-year aviation course in just 6 months. The days began before dawn and ended long after midnight, consisting of 14 hours of intense study and physical drill. They memorized navigation charts, learned the intricacies of meteorology, and studied the mechanics of internal combustion engines until their eyes blurred. Every moment was accounted for, and any sign of weakness was met with immediate reprimand. They were told repeatedly that the enemy would not care about their gender, and therefore neither would the standards of their training. The recruits were eventually divided into 3 distinct regiments based on their aptitude and skill levels. The 586th Fighter Aviation Regiment was assigned the Yakovlev Yak-1 fighters, tasked with defending key infrastructure. The 587th Bomber Aviation Regiment received the sophisticated Petlyakov P-2 dive bombers. But it was the 588th Night Bomber Regiment that drew the short straw. Assigned to fly the obsolete Polikarpov Po-2 biplanes, Major Yevdokia Bershanskaya, a woman of stern demeanor and immense experience, was appointed as the commander of the 588th. She looked over her new charges with a critical eye, knowing that they would be flying slow, wooden aircraft against the most advanced air force in the world. The male pilots stationed nearby often mocked the women of the 588th, derisively calling them Duncan's regiment and laughing at their oversized uniforms. They made bets on how long the women would last before running back to their mothers or breaking down in tears. This constant ridicule, however, had the opposite effect of what the men intended. It hardened the resolve of the women, igniting a fierce competitive spirit within them. They studied harder, marched with more precision, and endured the freezing temperatures without complaint, determined to prove their detractors wrong. Every sneer from a male counterpart became fuel for their ambition, driving them to master the controls of their aircraft with a precision that would soon silence the laughter. As the winter of 1941 deepened, The training intensified to include night flying, a dangerous practice even for experienced pilots. The Po-2 biplanes had no radar, no radios, and primitive instrumentation, forcing the pilots to rely entirely on visual landmarks and timing. They learned to navigate by the stars and the faint reflection of moonlight on the rivers below. The open cockpits exposed them to the full force of the sub-zero wind, freezing their faces and hands as they practiced takeoffs and landings in the pitch black. The mechanics, also women, worked barehanded on the frozen engines, their skin often peeling away on the icy metal as they kept the planes airworthy. By early 1942, the accelerated training program was nearing its conclusion, and the 588th Regiment was declared ready for combat deployment. They had transformed from a motley group of students and workers into a disciplined military unit, forged in the freezing winds of Engels. Marina Raskova addressed the regiment one final time before their departure to the front lines. She looked out at the rows of women standing at attention in their baggy uniforms and saw not girls, but warriors prepared to face death. The laughter of the men had faded, replaced by a grudging respect for the sheer tenacity these women displayed. The 588th was ready to head south, toward the blood-soaked steppes, where their legend would truly begin. The machine that the women of the 588th Regiment were expected to fly into the jaws of the German war machine looked less like a weapon of war and more like a relic from a bygone era of aviation. The Polikarpov Po-2, originally designed in the late 1922 as a flight trainer and agricultural crop duster, was a biplane constructed almost entirely of plywood and canvas. When the pilots first laid eyes on these fragile birds sitting on the frozen tarmac at Engels, a collective silence fell over the group. The aircraft were small, with a wingspan of just over 37 feet, and they seemed pitifully inadequate compared to the sleek, metal-skinned Messerschmitts and Junkers they would soon be fighting against. To the women, the Po-2 looked like a fragile toy that a strong gust of wind might shatter. Yet this collection of wood and fabric was the only chariot available to them. Touching the skin of the aircraft revealed the terrifying reality of their situation, as the fuselage was covered in nothing more than percale, a tightly woven cotton fabric stretched over a wooden frame. This material was coated in thick layers of dope to make it taut and waterproof, but this chemical treatment also had the unfortunate side effect of making the planes highly flammable. A single tracer bullet from a German machine gun could ignite the doped fabric instantly, turning the entire aircraft into a falling torch within seconds. There was no armor plating to protect the pilot or the navigator, and no self-sealing fuel tanks to prevent catastrophic explosions. The women realized quickly that their only defense against enemy fire would be the empty air between the bullets and their bodies. Climbing into the open cockpit was a logistical struggle, especially when weighed down by the heavy winter flying gear they were forced to wear. The workspace was cramped and Spartan, featuring a dashboard with only the most primitive instrumentation needed to keep the plane airborne. There were no radios to communicate with the ground or other pilots, meaning all coordination had to be done through hand signals or flashlight blinks in the dark. The lack of a radio also meant that once they took off, they were entirely alone in the void, severed from any help or guidance. The pilots had to rely on a magnetic compass, a turn and bank indicator, and a simple altimeter, none of which were illuminated, forcing them to use small flashlights to check their headings. The heart of the Po-2 was the Shvetsov M11, a 5-cylinder air-cooled radial engine that produced a meager 100 horsepower, roughly the same power as a small modern car. This engine was notoriously temperamental in the freezing Russian winter, often requiring the mechanics to heat it with open fires or hot water before it would even turn over. Once started, it rattled and shook the entire airframe, spitting oil and exhaust fumes back into the faces of the crew. The top speed of the aircraft was a laughable 90 miles per hour, which was slower than the stall speed of the advanced German fighters. This meant that if a German pilot tried to slow down enough to aim at them, his plane would likely stall and crash. A paradoxical advantage that the women would later learn to exploit. Training to fly these biplanes at night required a complete rewiring of the pilot's instincts and a mastery of sensory discipline. The instructors at Engels drilled them relentlessly on blind flying, a technique where the pilot had to maintain control of the aircraft without any visual reference to the ground or the horizon. They would fly under hoods or in the pitch-black night, trusting their internal equilibrium and the few vibrating needles on the dashboard. The greatest danger was spatial disorientation, where a pilot could lose track of up and down in the darkness, sending the plane into a fatal spiral. The women learned to suppress the panic that rose in their throats when the world outside the cockpit disappeared, replacing fear with a cold, calculated focus on the instruments. While the pilots mastered the air, the navigators were subjected to an equally grueling regimen that tested their mathematical precision and memory. Since they could not use radio navigation or radar, they had to rely on dead reckoning, a method of calculating position based on speed, time, and heading. They sat in the rear cockpit, exposed to the elements, clutching stopwatches and maps on their laps while the wind whipped around them. A mistake of just a few degrees or a miscalculation of wind speed could send them miles off course, lost behind enemy lines with no way to return. They memorized the geography of the terrain below, learning to identify rivers, railway lines, and forests by the faintest glint of starlight or the shadows cast on the snow. The mechanics of the 588th, all women as well, faced a physical ordeal that was just as demanding as that of the air crews. They worked outdoors in temperatures that frequently dropped to 30 degrees below zero, their hands constantly covered in grease and freezing metal. The Po, too, required constant maintenance. As the harsh conditions wreaked havoc on the wood and fabric structures, the mechanics had to patch holes in the canvas, tighten turnbuckles with frozen fingers, and manually swing the heavy wooden propellers to start the engines. This last task was dangerous. If the engine caught unexpectedly, the propeller could easily shatter an arm or take off a head. These ground crews worked 18-hour shifts, fueled only by meager rations and a fierce dedication to keeping their sisters in the air. As the training progressed, the women began to practice the specific tactical maneuvers that would define their combat operations. They learned to fly at treetop level, hugging the contours of the land to avoid detection by German searchlights and flak guns. The Po-2 was surprisingly maneuverable at low speeds, allowing the pilots to bank sharply and slip into ravines or behind tree lines at the last second. They practiced cutting the engine, a terrifying maneuver where they would idle the throttle to near silence and glide toward a target. This required perfect judgment of altitude and speed. If they cut the engine too early, they would crash short of the target. But if they did it too late, the noise would give them away. The physical toll of flying in open cockpits during the Russian winter became immediately apparent as frostbite became a common enemy. The wind chill factor at altitude was severe, freezing exposed skin within minutes and turning breath into ice crystals on their scarves. The women smeared their faces with goose fat in an attempt to insulate their skin, but even this offered limited protection against the biting gale. Their feet, encased in the oversized boots, would go numb shortly after takeoff, making it difficult to feel the rudder pedals. Despite the pain, they were forbidden from complaining, as any sign of physical weakness could be grounds for dismissal from the regiment. They suffered in silence, thawing their frozen limbs by the barrack stove after each flight. Arming the aircraft was a labor-intensive process that highlighted the primitive nature of their equipment. The Po-2 could carry only a light bomb load, usually around 400 to 600 pounds, consisting of small fragmentation bombs or incendiaries. Since the plane sat low to the ground, the mechanics and navigators had to lift the bombs manually and hook them onto the racks under the wings. There were no hydraulic lifts or loading machinery. It was sheer muscle power, often performed in deep snow and darkness. A fully loaded Po-2 was heavy and sluggish, requiring every inch of the runway to get airborne. The pilots had to handle the controls with extreme delicacy, coaxing the overburdened biplanes into the sky without stalling the engine. The skepticism from the male military establishment continued to linger over the airfield like a heavy fog. Inspecting officers would often watch the women train with critical eyes, waiting for a crash or a major error to justify disbanding the unit. However, the women of the 588th met this scrutiny with a perfectionism that bordered on obsession. They flew their patterns with geometric precision. Their landings were feather-light, and their navigation was flawlessly accurate. Slowly, the derision turned into a grudging acceptance, as the men realized that these women handled the temperamental Po-2 seconds with more finesse than many male cadets. The nickname Duncan's Regiment began to fade, replaced by a wary respect for their competence. One of the most controversial aspects of their equipment was the initial decision to deny them parachutes. The rationale was twofold. First, the parachutes were in short supply and prioritized for fighter pilots. Second, the Po-2 seconds struggled with weight, and every pound saved meant an extra bomb or more fuel. This meant that if their plane caught fire or was structurally damaged, the women had no escape option other than to ride the burning wreckage to the ground. It was a psychological burden that sat heavy in their minds, knowing that a single mistake or a lucky enemy shot would be a death sentence. Yet, they accepted this fatalistic reality, viewing the lack of parachutes as just another hardship to be endured for the sake of the mission. The camaraderie within the regiment deepened as the hardships forged an unbreakable bond between the crews. A pilot and her navigator were like two halves of the same brain, anticipating each other's moves and trusting each other with their lives. They developed a unique language of gestures and touches to communicate over the roar of the wind and engine. In the barracks, they shared their fears, their letters from home, and the small luxuries they managed to scrounge. Like a bar of chocolate or a pair of warm socks, they became a family, isolated on the frozen steppe, united by the singular purpose of proving their worth and striking back at the invaders. By May of 1942, the frenetic pace of training came to a head as the regiment prepared for its final examination. The commanding officers from the Air Force arrived to assess whether the 588th was truly combat-ready. The women performed a series of complex night maneuvers, bombing runs on dummy targets, and formation flying that demonstrated their mastery of the aircraft. The inspectors could find no technical faults, the discipline was ironclad, and the skills were undeniable. With a signature on a piece of paper, the experiment was declared a success, and the 588th Night Bomber Regiment was officially cleared for active duty. The time for practice was over. The real war was waiting for them in the south. The order to deploy came swiftly, sending a jolt of electricity through the camp. The women packed their meager belongings, loading their navigational charts, their oversized uniforms, and their few personal mementos into the transport trucks. The mood was a mix of exhilaration and somber realization that some of them would not return. As they stood on the airfield one last time, looking at their canvas planes, they were no longer the naive girls who had arrived in cattle cars months earlier. They were pilots and navigators of the Red Army, bound for the southern front where the German advance was threatening to break the Soviet Union's spine. They climbed into their cockpits, fired up the noisy engines, and took to the sky, turning their noses toward the fire and blood of the front lines. On May 23, 1942, the 588th Night Bomber Regiment finally arrived at their designated forward operating base near the village of Trudgornyaka on the southern front. The transition from the sterile training grounds of Engels to the chaotic reality of the war zone was jarring and immediate for every woman in the unit. The air here tasted different, heavy with the acrid metallic tang of cordite and the lingering stench of unburied bodies rotting in the no-man's land beyond. The horizon was not a flat line of snow, but a jagged scar of smoke and fire that pulsed rhythmically with the dull thud of heavy artillery. For the first time, the war was not a theoretical concept or a line on a map, but a physical beast that lived and breathed just a few miles to the west. The airfield assigned to them was little more than a flattened strip of dirt located uncomfortably close to the front lines, well within the range of German long-range guns. As the women unloaded their equipment and camouflaged their Po-2 biplanes under nets and tree branches, they could hear the constant rattle of machine gun fire carried on the wind. The living conditions were primitive, forcing the pilots and mechanics to dig their own slit trenches and dugouts to sleep in. As the village buildings were prime targets for the Luftwaffe, they learned quickly that survival here meant becoming invisible, blending into the landscape during the day so they could become predators during the night. Major Bershanskaya wasted no time in preparing her regiment for their first combat sortie, understanding that hesitation would only breed fear among the rookies. On June 8, 1942, the order came down to strike enemy headquarters and supply depots concentrated near the Mayas River. The atmosphere in the briefing room was thick with a suffocating tension as the navigators marked their maps with trembling hands. Bershanskaya's voice was steady and cold as she outlined the flight paths, her demeanor serving as an anchor for the terrified young women. She reminded them that they were no longer students but soldiers of the Red Army, and that the men dying in the trenches below were counting on them to clear the path. As twilight bled into the ink-black darkness of the steppes, the airfield exploded into a flurry of disciplined activity. The mechanics, their faces smeared with grease and dirt, spun the wooden propellers with practiced force, bringing the engines to life with a series of sharp cracks and sputters. The pilots climbed into their cockpits, checking their revolvers and adjusting their flight caps, while the navigators double-checked the bomb release mechanisms. There were no radios to offer last-minute words of encouragement, only a thumbs-up from the ground crew and the roar of the wind. One by one, the fragile biplanes taxied down the uneven dirt strip and lifted sluggishly into the night sky, turning their noses toward the enemy. Crossing the front line for the first time was a surreal experience that seared itself into the memory of every pilot who flew that night. Below them, the earth seemed to be cracked open, revealing a glowing vein of fire where the two massive armies were locked in combat. Tracers arced through the sky like angry red hornets, and the flashes of mortar rounds illuminated the scarred landscape in strobe-like bursts. The women felt naked in their open cockpits, suspended in the air at 2,000 feet with nothing but canvas between them and the inferno below. The noise of the battle was drowned out by their engines, creating a strange sense of isolation amidst the chaos of total war. The target area approached quickly, signaled by the sudden eruption of German searchlights that sliced through the darkness like pillars of solid ice. For the pilots of the 588th, this was their first encounter with the terrifying efficiency of the German air defense network. The beams of light were blindingly bright, hunting across the sky in search of the slow-moving intruders. When a beam caught a Po-2, the cockpit was instantly flooded with a dazzling white glare that washed out the instruments and left the pilot disoriented. Instinct screamed at them to dive or turn away, but their training took over, forcing them to hold their course through the tunnel of light toward the drop zone. Then came the flak, the anti-aircraft fire that the veterans called the dogs of war barking at their heels. Black puffs of smoke blossomed around the fragile planes, accompanied by the terrifying sound of shrapnel tearing through the air. The Po-2 seconds were tossed around like leaves in a storm by the concussive shockwaves of the exploding shells. The fabric skins of the aircraft drummed and vibrated, and the smell of sulfur filled the cockpits. It took nerves of steel to keep the planes steady while the sky around them tried to swat them down. The navigators leaned over the sides, eyes watering from the wind, looking for the precise moment to release their deadly cargo. With a heavy clunk, the bombs fell away from the racks, lightening the aircraft instantly and causing it to surge upward. The crews held their breath for the agonizing seconds it took for the explosives to plummet to the earth. Below, orange fireballs erupted as the bombs struck the supply depots and fuel dumps, sending plumes of smoke billowing into the searchlight beams. The satisfaction of a direct hit was quickly replaced by the urgent need to escape. The pilots banked sharply, diving toward the darkness to shake off the searchlights that were still clawing at their tails. The flight back to base was a race against adrenaline and exhaustion, with every shadow on the ground looking like a hidden enemy gun. The return to Trudgornyaka was a chaotic scene of relief and frantic activity as the planes touched down one after another. Mechanics rushed to inspect the aircraft, finding holes in the wings and fuselage where shrapnel had passed cleanly through the fabric. The pilots and navigators climbed out, their legs shaking uncontrollably from the adrenaline dump, their faces marked with soot and goggle rings. They lit cigarettes with trembling hands, exchanging wide-eyed glances that said more than words ever could. They had survived. They had looked into the face of the German war machine and returned to tell the tale. But the celebration was muted, for they knew this was only the first night of thousands. However, the reality of their mortality struck the regiment with devastating force just a few nights later. The crews of Olkhovskaya and Tarasova failed to return from a mission, disappearing into the void of the night without a trace. The silence of the empty airfield as the sun rose was heavier than any bombardment, a grim confirmation that their luck had run out. Days later, locals found the wreckage of their planes, The women had been shot down and died fighting on the ground with their sidearms. This loss shattered the lingering illusion of adventure. The women of the 588th packed away the belongings of their fallen sisters in silence, hardening their hearts. Sorrow was a luxury they could not afford. Revenge was the only currency that mattered now. The Germans, initially confused by the harassment from these slow, silent aircraft, soon began to develop a deep psychological hatred for the 588th. The raids were not devastating in terms of tonnage. The Po-2 could only carry a small load, but they were relentless. The planes arrived singly, every few minutes, all night long, preventing the German soldiers from getting a single moment of sleep. The constant drone of the engines, followed by the whistle of dropping bombs, frayed the nerves of the Wehrmacht troops. They began to call the pilots Nachthexen, night witches, claiming that the women had been given injections that allowed them to see in the dark like cats. This moniker, meant as an insult, became a badge of honor that the regiment wore with pride. To maintain this relentless tempo, the ground crews performed miracles of logistics and endurance under the open sky. As soon as a plane landed, the mechanics would sprint to it, refuel the tank, patch the fabric holes, and hang new bombs on the racks. The turnaround time was often less than 5 minutes. A single crew might fly as many as 10 or 12 sorties in a single night, taking off, bombing, and returning until the sun began to crest the horizon. The exhaustion was absolute. Women would fall asleep standing up or collapse under the wings of their planes while waiting for the next load. Their hands bled from the cold and the sharp metal, but the assembly line of destruction never stopped. The physical toll on the pilots was compounded by the unique physical demands of flying the Po-2 without modern controls. The control stick required significant physical strength to manipulate, especially in turbulence, and there was no autopilot to offer even a second of relief. By the end of a night of sorties, the pilots' arms were heavy as lead, their muscles burning with lactic acid. They had to be lifted out of their cockpits by the mechanics, too weak to climb down on their own. Yet, after a few hours of fitful sleep in a damp dugout, they would be back at the briefing table, eyes red-rimmed but focused, ready to do it all again. As the summer of 1942 pressed on, the southern front began to collapse under a massive German offensive aimed at the oil fields of the Caucasus. The 588th was forced to retreat, moving from airfield to airfield, always just one step ahead of the advancing panzer divisions. They flew defensive missions now, bombing bridges and river crossings to slow the enemy tide. The retreat was demoralizing, seeing the land they had fought for being swallowed up by the swastika. But even in retreat, they remained a thorn in the side of the invader, a persistent mosquito bite that refused to heal. By the time the regiment reached the foothills of the Caucasus Mountains, the night witches had fully transformed. The fear that had gripped them during that first mission over the Mias River had been replaced by a cold, professional efficiency. They had learned to read the sky like a book, to use the clouds as cover, and to anticipate the patterns of the German searchlights. They had buried their friends and learned to live with the ghost of death sitting in the cockpit beside them. The baptism of fire was over. The war of attrition had begun. They were no longer just women flying planes. They were a precise, deadly instrument of the Soviet Air Force. And the Germans were about to learn just how dangerous they could be. The defining characteristic of the 588th Regiment's warfare was not the overwhelming force of their bombardment, but the terrifying silence that preceded it. The pilots quickly realized that the Polikarpov Po-2, with its noisy radial engine and slow speed, was a sitting duck if flown like a conventional bomber. To survive against the sophisticated German air defenses, they had to turn the weakness of their aircraft into its greatest strength. They developed a tactic that was as ingenious as it was dangerous, a maneuver that required nerves of steel and perfect coordination between the pilot and the navigator. This technique involved cutting the engine mid-flight, transforming the clattering biplane into a silent glider that drifted through the night like a ghost. The execution of this maneuver began miles away from the target, where the pilot would laboriously climb the aircraft to a higher altitude, straining the underpowered engine to its limit. Once they reached the designated height, the pilot would throttle back the engine to a mere idle, causing the roar of the cylinders to die away instantly. The sudden silence in the cockpit was jarring, replaced only by the whistling of the wind through the bracing wires and the creaking of the wooden fuselage. In this state, the plane became virtually invisible to the acoustic locators that the Germans used to detect incoming aircraft, allowing the women to slip through the outer defensive perimeter undetected. It was this specific phase of the attack that earned the regiment their infamous German moniker, the Nachthexen, or Night Witches. As the gliders passed overhead, the wind rushing over the canvas wings and the tension wires created a distinct, soft rustling sound. To the terrified German infantrymen huddled in their trenches below, this noise sounded uncannily like the swooping of a witch's broomstick from grim folklore. There was no mechanical roar to warn them, only that strange whisper in the darkness, followed seconds later by the devastating whistle of falling bombs. The psychological impact of this sound was profound, breeding a superstitious dread among the enemy troops. However, the silence came with a significant technical risk that the pilots had to manage with extreme care. The M11 engine of the Po-2 was air-cooled, meaning it relied on the airflow from the propeller and the forward motion of the plane to prevent overheating. Conversely, during a long glide in the freezing Russian winter, the engine could cool down so rapidly that it would seize up or fail to restart when the throttle was applied again. The pilots had to periodically blip the throttle, giving the engine a short burst of fuel to keep the cylinders warm, a delicate action that risked revealing their position with a sudden flash of exhaust and noise. The tactical doctrine of the 588th evolved to include complex coordination between multiple aircraft to suppress the deadly German searchlights. They flew in loose formations of 3, approaching the target area from different directions to confuse the ground defenders. 2 of the aircraft would intentionally draw attention to themselves, revving their engines and firing flares to attract the beams of the searchlights. As the German gunners traversed their lights and flak cannons toward the decoys, the third plane would glide in silently from the darkness above. This bait-and-switch tactic was incredibly dangerous for the decoys, who had to dance through a web of fire while their sister delivered the payload. Once the bombs were released, the pilot had to immediately transition from a stealthy glider back into a powered aircraft to escape the blast zone. This was the moment of maximum vulnerability, as the pilot slammed the throttle forward, hoping the cold engine would catch. The sudden roar of the engine coming back to life would instantly alert every gunner in the vicinity to their exact location. The sky would erupt with tracer fire, forcing the pilot to bank aggressively and drop to treetop level. They utilized the darkness of the terrain, flying dangerously close to the ground where the German radar and heavy flak guns could not track them effectively. The low stall speed of the Po-2, which was a major liability in transit, became a surprising defensive asset when engaging with the Luftwaffe's night fighters. The German Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Focke-Wulf Fu 190 were designed for high-speed interception, with stall speeds that were nearly double the Po-2's top speed. If a German fighter pilot tried to slow down enough to line up a shot on the biplane, his aircraft would lose lift and stall, potentially causing a crash. The women learned to exploit this by flying low and slow, forcing the Germans to make high-speed slashing attacks that gave them only a fraction of a second to aim before they overshot their target. When caught in the blinding glare of searchlights, the pilots employed a desperate maneuver, known as the side-slip, to escape the lethal cone of illumination. By crossing the controls, applying left rudder while banking right, or vice versa, the pilot could force the plane to skid sideways through the air while maintaining its forward heading. This drastic change in flight path was often enough to confuse the searchlight operators, causing the beam to lose its lock on the aircraft. The physical exertion required to hold the plane in a slip against the turbulence of exploding flak shells was immense, often leaving the pilots drenched in sweat despite the freezing temperatures. The precision of their bombing was another tactical necessity born of their limited payload capacity. Since the Po-2 could only carry 2 bombs at a time, usually weighing no more than 100 kilograms each, they could not afford to miss. Unlike the heavy bombers that carpeted entire grids, the Night Witches functioned more like snipers. They targeted specific fuel depots, ammunition dumps, and command tents, aiming to cause secondary explosions that would amplify the damage. The navigators, leaning over the side of the cockpit with the wind tearing at their faces, became experts at judging the trajectory, often dropping their bombs from as low as 400 meters to ensure a direct hit. The relentless nature of their sorties was a tactic in itself, designed to wage a war of exhaustion against the German invaders. The 588th did not just attack to destroy infrastructure, they attacked to destroy the enemy's ability to rest. By maintaining a constant presence over the German lines from dusk until dawn, they ensured that the soldiers below could never close their eyes without fear of death. This sleep deprivation had a corrosive effect on the morale and combat effectiveness of the German units. Prisoners of war later confessed that the sewing machines, as they sometimes called the Po-2 seconds, were more feared than heavy artillery because the harassment simply never stopped. Navigating to these precise targets night after night without modern avionics required the navigators to develop a mental map of the chaos below. They learned to read the landscape by the color of the explosions and the patterns of the fires burning on the ground. They used the Germans' own infrastructure against them, following the headlights of supply convoys or the sparks from railway engines to locate their targets. When the weather turned foul and obscured the ground, they timed their flights with a stopwatch, calculating wind drift and speed to drop their bombs on a mathematical prediction, trusting their lives to the accuracy of their arithmetic. The danger of friendly fire was another hazard that the regiment had to navigate with their tactical planning. Because they flew so low and their engines sounded different from standard Soviet aircraft, they were often mistaken for German reconnaissance planes by nervous Red Army ground troops. The pilots had to memorize the daily passcodes and signal flare colors to identify themselves when crossing back over their own lines. A forgotten flare or a misunderstanding could result in a hail of bullets from their own comrades, adding another layer of anxiety to the return leg of every mission. Despite the defensive advantages of their slow speed, the reality of aerial combat was that one lucky shot could end it all. The Po-2 had no armor plating, and the fuel tank was located directly between the pilot and the engine. A single incendiary bullet striking the tank would turn the canvas plane into a fireball in seconds. The tactical response to being hit was grim if the fire was small. The pilot might try to put the plane into a steep sideslip to blow the flames away from the fuselage. If the fire took hold, however, the lack of parachutes meant that the crew had no options. They flew with the knowledge that their tactics had to be perfect, for there was no safety net. The Germans, infuriated by their inability to stop these primitive aircraft, began to dedicate specialized resources to hunting the night witches. They set up flak circuses, concentrated rings of anti-aircraft guns paired with dozens of searchlights specifically designed to trap the Po-2 seconds. They also began deploying night fighters equipped with radar to patrol the approach corridors. The rumored reward for shooting down one of these female pilots was the Iron Cross, a testament to how significant a threat the German High Command considered this regiment. Yet, the higher the bounty, the more determined the women became to slip through the net. By the autumn of 1942, the 588th had refined these tactics into a deadly art form, conducting thousands of sorties that bled the German rear lines. They had mastered the air, the darkness, and their own fear, turning a crop duster into a strategic weapon. But the war was shifting again. The battle for the Caucasus was reaching a fever pitch, and the regiment was about to face its most intense challenge yet over the Kuban bridgehead. The tactics they had perfected would be tested to the breaking point as the density of German fire increased, turning the night sky into a solid wall of steel and flame. By the spring of 1943, the theatre of war had shifted to the Kuban region, a strategic bridgehead east of the Crimea, where the Wehrmacht had constructed a formidable defensive fortification known as the Blue Line. The 588th Regiment, now honoured with the title of Guards and renamed the 46th Tumen Guards Night Bomber Aviation Regiment, found themselves flying into the teeth of the most concentrated air defence network they had ever encountered. The Germans, desperate to hold this line, had massed thousands of anti-aircraft guns and searchlights along a narrow strip of land, creating a veritable wall of steel and light. The casual harassment missions of the previous year were over. The air over the Kuban was a slaughterhouse, and the regiment was about to pay a terrible price in blood. The German Luftwaffe, stinging from the humiliation of being unable to stop the wooden biplanes, deployed specialized night fighter units to the sector with the sole purpose of exterminating the night witches. These were not the standard patrols of the past, But dedicated hunter-killer teams, equipped with Messerschmitt Bf 110 heavy fighters, these twin-engine destroyers carried radar arrays and heavy cannons capable of tearing a Po-2 into splinters with a single burst. The German pilots were aces, veterans transferred from other fronts, and they had learned the habits of the Soviet women. They no longer waited for the bombers to reach the target, they stalked the approach corridors. Waiting in the darkness like sharks sensing blood in the water, the tactics of the enemy ground crews also evolved into a terrifying trap known among the aviators as the flak circus. Instead of searching randomly, the Germans would coordinate dozens of searchlights to switch on simultaneously, creating a blinding cage of light that was impossible to escape. Once a Po-2 was trapped in this intersection of beams, the anti-aircraft guns would unleash a torrent of flak so dense that the sky seemed to turn solid. The pilots called this experience being crucified, as the beams pinned them against the black sky, leaving them helpless while the tracers hammered their fragile wings. It was a psychological weapon as much as a physical one, designed to break the nerve of the pilots before the shells even struck. The darkest hour for the regiment came on the night of July 31, 1943, a date that would be etched in black in the unit's history. The mission seemed routine at first, but as the planes approached the target near the village of Krimskaya, the trap was sprung with devastating precision. A German night fighter ace, Josef Kotyok, had infiltrated their formation, using the noise of the flak to mask his own engine. One by one, he picked off the Po-2 seconds, firing incendiary rounds into their fuel tanks. The sky was lit up not by searchlights, but by the horrific sight of 4 Soviet aircraft turning into falling torches. From the cockpits of the surviving planes, the other pilots were forced to watch their sisters burn to death in mid-air. There were no parachutes to offer a chance of escape, and the low altitude meant there was no time to maneuver or crash land. They saw the silhouettes of their friends in the flaming cockpits, struggling with the controls until the fire consumed them. The radio silence was broken by the visual screams of the dying aircraft plummeting to the earth. It was a massacre that shook the regiment to its core, proving that their stealth tactics were no longer invincible against a determined and technologically superior enemy. The losses that night included some of the regiment's most beloved crews, including High Lieutenants Anna Vysotskaya and Galina Dokutovich. When the survivors returned to the airfield, the silence in the mess hall was deafening. There were empty chairs at the breakfast table, and the untouched belongings of the dead sat in the barracks as grim reminders of the night's horror. Major Bershanskaya, her face a mask of grief and iron resolve, ordered the personal effects to be packed away immediately. She knew that allowing the women to dwell on the tragedy would destroy their combat effectiveness. They had to grieve, but they had to do it while reloading the bomb racks for the next night. The legend of the Iron Cross began to circulate widely during this bloody period, adding a layer of mythical dread to their nightly sorties. Rumors reached the Soviet side that the German High Command was so infuriated by the Night Witches that they had promised the Iron Cross medal to any pilot who confirmed a kill against a Po-2. Whether this was official policy or merely trench folklore, it reflected the high priority the Germans placed on destroying the regiment. The women knew they were no longer just a nuisance. They were high-value targets, and every German gunner and pilot on the Blue Line was hunting them for glory and a medal. Despite the carnage, the regiment refused to stand down or reduce the tempo of their operations. In fact, they adapted with a ferocity that bordered on suicidal. To counter the searchlights and flak circuses, they began flying even lower, practically skimming the rooftops and tree lines where the heavy guns could not depress their barrels low enough to track them. They started flying in larger groups to saturate the defenses, sacrificing stealth for sheer volume of fire. If the Germans wanted a fight, the Guards regiment would give them one, trading their lives for every inch of the Kuban bridgehead. The mechanics worked with frantic energy to repair the planes that managed to limp back home, their fuselages riddled with holes. They patched the canvas with whatever fabric they could find, often using pieces of old uniforms or bedsheets, leaving the aircraft looking like patchwork quilts of war. Every plane that could fly was sent back up, sometimes with the blood of the previous crew still staining the wooden floorboards of the cockpit. The pilots wiped it away and climbed in, their hands shaking not from fear, but from a cold, consuming rage. They were fighting for the memory of their fallen sisters now. And that motivation was more powerful than any order from Stalin. One memorable innovation during the battles over the Kuban was the increased use of retrofitted machine guns on the Po-2 seconds for self-defense. Historically, the navigators had been defenseless, but now some planes were equipped with a rear-facing Sheikhaz machine gun. While it was no match for the cannons of a Messerschmitt, it allowed the women to fire back, to send a stream of tracers into the darkness at their tormentors. This small change had a significant psychological effect on the crews. They were no longer passive victims waiting to be shot down, but warriors who could bite back. It gave them a sliver of agency in a sky dominated by monsters. The battle for the Kuban dragged on for months, a grinding war of attrition that tested the limits of human endurance. The regiment flew up to 18 sorties a night during the peak of the fighting, pushing their bodies beyond the point of exhaustion. Pilots would land, drink a cup of strong tea while the bombs were loaded, and take off again without stepping out of the cockpit. They hallucinated from lack of sleep, seeing phantom mountains in the clouds or imagining enemy fighters where there were only stars. Yet, the blue line was slowly crumbling under the relentless pressure of the Soviet assault, and the night witches were hammering the cracks wide open. By September 1943, the German forces began to withdraw from the Kuban bridgehead, retreating across the Kerch Strait into the Crimea. The 46th Guards Regiment had played a pivotal role in breaking the enemy's defences, dropping tons of explosives on the very positions that had claimed so many of their friends. The cost had been exorbitant, but they had survived the inferno. As the front line moved west, the women looked back at the scorched earth of the Kuban, leaving behind the graves of their comrades. They had faced the best the Luftwaffe had to offer and had not broken. The liberation of Novorossiysk marked the end of the Kuban campaign and the beginning of the next chapter in their journey. The regiment was exhausted, their numbers depleted, and their aircraft battered, but their spirit was harder than the steel of the German tanks they destroyed. They had earned their Guards title in the fires of the Blue Line, and the Night Witches were no longer just a nickname, it was a title of fear and respect that rang out across the entire Eastern Front. Now, their eyes turned toward the Crimean Peninsula, the next fortress to be breached on the long road to Berlin. As they packed their equipment for the transfer to the next airfield, the mood was different than it had been in the early days. The naive excitement was gone, replaced by the weary professionalism of veterans who had seen too much. They moved with a quiet efficiency, their movements synchronized and purposeful. They were a sisterhood forged in blood, bound together by the secrets of the night sky and the shared trauma of the Kuban. The war was far from over, and the shadows of the Crimea waited for them, promising new dangers and new targets for their silent, deadly gliders. The winter of 1943 descended upon the Crimean Peninsula with a ferocity that rivaled the violence of the war itself, turning the Kerch Strait into a churning cauldron of black water and freezing mist. For the 46th Guards Regiment, the battle to liberate Crimea was not merely a fight against the entrenched German 17th Army, but a struggle against the elements that threatened to swallow their fragile aircraft whole. The mission was to support the Eltigen landing, a desperate beachhead where Soviet Marines were pinned down by heavy fire, cut off from supply lines, and slowly starving. The task fell to the Night Witches to act not just as bombers, but as a lifeline, flying low-level supply drops through storms that grounded the rest of the Soviet Air Force. Flying over the open sea presented a terrifying new set of variables that the pilots had never encountered over the solid steppes of Russia. The turbulent winds whipping off the Black Sea tossed the lightweight Po-2 biplanes around like paper kites, requiring immense physical strength to keep them on course. Without visual landmarks on the shifting waves, the navigators had to rely entirely on dead reckoning and the timing of their watches to find the tiny strip of land held by the Marines. A miscalculation of just a few seconds meant dropping precious ammunition into the ocean, or, worse, crashing into the dark, freezing water where survival time was measured in minutes. The nature of their payload shifted during these frantic nights, replacing high-explosive bombs with burlap sacks filled with dried bread, canned meat, and medical bandages. The pilots had to fly dangerously low, often under 50 feet, to ensure the supplies landed within the narrow Soviet perimeter rather than drifting into German lines. They developed a technique of cutting their engines and gliding in silence, not to avoid flak, but to hear the shouts of the Marines on the ground guiding them in, the gratitude of the soldiers below, who were surviving solely on the deliveries from the sisters in the sky, forged a deep emotional connection between the infantry and the aviators. As the Red Army slowly ground its way forward, breaking the blockade and liberating the Crimean port of Sevastopol in May 1944, the regiment was granted a brief moment of respite. They walked through the ruins of the city, seeing the devastation wrought by years of occupation, but also the hope returning to the faces of the civilians. The victory in Crimea was a turning point, signaling the end of defensive operations and the beginning of the great push westward. The pilots washed the salt spray from their aircraft, patched the canvas yet again, and turned their eyes toward the setting sun. The borders of the Soviet Union were behind them. Ahead lay the road to the heart of the Third Reich. The journey through Belarus and into Poland in the summer of 1944 revealed the true scale of the horror that had been inflicted upon Eastern Europe. As the regiment moved from airfield to airfield, advancing alongside the tank columns, they flew over a landscape that had been scorched into oblivion by the retreating Wehrmacht. They saw villages reduced to ash, bridges blown into rivers, and vast stretches of forest leveled by artillery. But nothing could prepare them for what they encountered near the Polish city of Lublin, where the Majdanek concentration camp was liberated by Soviet troops. Word of the death camps spread through the regiment like a toxic cloud, shattering whatever innocence or detachment the women still possessed. They visited the site, seeing the gas chambers, the crematoriums, and the mountains of shoes belonging to the victims who had been murdered there. The realization that they were fighting against a regime capable of such industrialized evil transformed their motivation from patriotic duty into a cold, burning desire for retribution. They were no longer just fighting to protect their homes, they were fighting to eradicate a cancer from the earth. The bombs they loaded onto their racks that night felt heavier, carrying the weight of judgment. Crossing the border into East Prussia in early 1945 marked a profound psychological shift for every member of the 46th Guards Regiment. They passed wooden signboards erected by the political commissars that read, "Soldier, you are now entering the lair of the fascist beast." The landscape changed from the familiar wooden cottages of Russia to the manicured brick towns and paved roads of Germany. For the first time, they were flying over the land of the enemy, looking down at the very cities that had spawned the invaders who had killed their families. The air crackled with a new intensity. This was no longer a war of liberation, but a war of conquest. The resistance over German soil was frantic and desperate, as the Luftwaffe and anti-aircraft crews fought with the knowledge that their own homes were now on the front line. The flak density increased exponentially, as the retreating German units were compressed into a smaller and smaller geographic area. Searchlights seemed to cover every square inch of the sky, creating a grid of light that was nearly impossible to slip through unnoticed. The pilots had to fly with aggressive precision, banking hard through walls of exploding steel, knowing that the enemy below was fighting with the ferocity of a trapped animal. The weather during the winter of 1945 was abysmal, with heavy snowstorms and thick fog that grounded most of the heavy bomber regiments. However, the Po-2 seconds, with their low speed and ability to operate from primitive improvised runways, continued to fly when no one else could. They used the bad weather as cover, slipping through the snow squalls to drop their payloads on German rail hubs and troop concentrations. The mechanics worked in freezing mud, their hands cracking and bleeding, fueled by the adrenaline of knowing that the end of the war was finally within reach. Every sortie brought them 1 mile closer to Berlin. One of the greatest dangers during this phase was the sheer congestion of the airspace over the shrinking front line. The sky was crowded with Soviet aircraft of all types, fighters, Stormoviks, and heavy bombers all vying for the same targets in a chaotic airspace. The risk of mid-air collisions became a serious threat, especially for the unlit, slow-moving Po-2 seconds. The women had to be constantly vigilant, looking out not just for German night fighters, but for the looming shapes of their own friendly aircraft thundering past them in the dark. It was a chaotic symphony of destruction, orchestrated in the narrow corridor leading to the German capital. The crossing of the Oder River was the final major hurdle before Berlin, a natural barrier that the Germans defended with fanatical determination. The 46th Guards Regiment was tasked with softening up the defences on the western bank, targeting the artillery batteries that were pounding the Soviet pontoon bridges. The sorties were short and intense, often lasting only 20 minutes, allowing crews to fly multiple missions in rapid succession. The river below reflected the constant flashes of artillery, turning the water into a shimmering ribbon of blood and fire. The women flew through the smoke of the battlefield, breathing in the smell of the final offensive. Despite the proximity of victory, the Grim Reaper continued to harvest the lives of the regiment's best pilots right up until the very end. The tragedy of dying so close to the finish line, when the rumors of surrender were already whispering through the ranks, was a heavy burden to bear. Every empty chair in the mess hall now felt like a cruel cosmic joke. They mourned their losses with a stoic silence, refusing to let grief slow down the operational tempo. They owed it to the fallen to finish the job, to ensure that their sacrifice purchased the final destruction of the Nazi regime. As they pushed deeper into Germany, the infrastructure of the regiment began to stretch to its breaking point. Supplies of high-octane fuel and spare parts struggled to keep up with the rapid advance of the front line. The mechanics cannibalized wrecked aircraft for parts, performing miracles of engineering to keep the aging fleet of Po-2 seconds airworthy. The planes themselves were battered and war-weary, their engines tired, and their frames warped by years of combat and exposure to the elements. Yet, like the women who flew them, the wooden biplanes refused to quit, driven forward by sheer force of will. The psychological pressure on the German troops on the ground was amplified by the knowledge that the night witches were now over their own soil. The distinctive sound of the Po-2 engines became a harbinger of doom for the German civilians and soldiers alike. The regiment dropped propaganda leaflets along with their bombs, demanding surrender and promising inevitable defeat. The psychological warfare was as effective as the high explosives, eroding the will of the enemy to continue the fight. The women of the 46 were no longer just soldiers. They were the terrifying embodiment of Soviet vengeance, coming for them in the dark. By April 1945, the regiment had established an airfield less than 60 kilometers from Berlin, close enough to see the glow of the burning city on the horizon at night. The sky ahead was a constant twilight of fires and searchlights, marking the death throes of the Third Reich. The excitement in the camp was electric, a mixture of exhaustion and euphoria. They had started as a group of young girls in oversized uniforms in Moscow, and they had flown, mile by bloody mile, to the gates of the enemy's capital. The long nightmare was almost over, and the night witches were preparing for their final curtain call over the ruins of Berlin. On May 8, 1945, a strange and unsettling silence fell over the airfield north of Berlin, a stark contrast to the deafening cacophony of artillery and engines that had defined the last 4 years. The radio operator in the command tent received the signal that the German High Command had signed the act of unconditional surrender, officially ending the Great Patriotic War. For the women of the 46th Guards Regiment, the news did not result in immediate cheering, but rather a collective exhale, a release of breath they felt they had been holding since 1941. They walked out onto the tarmac and looked at the sky, realizing for the first time that the darkness above was no longer a threat to be managed, but simply the night. The following days were a blur of euphoric celebration and poignant reflection as the reality of their survival began to sink in. They traveled to the ruins of the Reichstag in the heart of Berlin, joining thousands of other Red Army soldiers who were leaving their mark on the fallen capital. With pieces of charcoal or chalk, the pilots wrote their names and the name of their regiment on the scarred pillars of the German Parliament building. The night witches were here, they scrawled, a final act of defiance, and a permanent record that the women they had mocked had been there to witness their total defeat. It was a moment of supreme vindication, standing in the ashes of the regime that had tried to enslave them. However, the taste of victory was soon soured by a bitter realization regarding their place in the official narrative of the triumph. As preparations began for the massive Moscow Victory Parade scheduled for June 1945, the regiment expected to take their rightful place among the heroes of the Soviet Union. They practiced their marching drills, polished their medals, and prepared their battered Po-2 biplanes for a flyover above Red Square. But the order came down from the High Command that shattered their pride. The 46th Guards Regiment would not be participating in the parade. The official reasoning was a devastating blow to their identity as aviators and soldiers. The authorities deemed the Polikarpov Po-2 aircraft too slow and unimpressive to be showcased alongside the sleek new Yak-3 fighters and Tu-2 bombers that Stalin wanted to display to the world. Furthermore, the women were told that their marching was not up to the standard drill precision required for such a prestigious event. After flying thousands of combat sorties and enduring hell on the front lines, they were essentially told they did not look the part of the polished, masculine Soviet hero. They were relegated to the sidelines, forced to watch as the male units they had supported and protected marched through the applause of the nation. It was a final, stinging reminder that despite their sacrifice, they were still viewed as anomalies in a man's world. The dissolution of the regiment followed swiftly in October 1945, dismantling the sisterhood that had been their entire world for nearly 4 years. The demobilization process was abrupt. The women were ordered to return their uniforms, their flight gear, and their sidearms. They hugged each other on the airfield for the last time, promising to write. But deep down they knew that life was pulling them in different directions. The Night Witches ceased to exist as a military unit, vanishing as quickly and silently as they had appeared over German targets. They boarded trains not as conquering heroes, but as civilians, carrying small suitcases back to the lives they had interrupted to save their country. Reintegrating into civilian society proved to be a psychological minefield for many of the veterans. They returned to a country that was desperate to rebuild and normalize, which meant a societal push for women to return to traditional roles as mothers and workers. The ferocity and independence they had cultivated in the cockpit were now seen as undesirable traits. When they tried to share their stories, they were often met with disbelief or indifference from neighbors who could not reconcile the image of a young woman with the pilot of a bomber. The war was over, and the Soviet Union wanted its women back in the kitchen and the factory, not in the sky. A pervasive stigma also shadowed many female veterans, born of the sexist rumors that had circulated during the war. Men who had served on the front lines often referred to women in the military as field wives, implying that their primary role had been sexual rather than combat-oriented. To avoid this shame and to protect their marriage prospects, many former pilots of the 46th hid their medals and never spoke of their service. They buried their pasts deep inside, living ordinary lives as teachers, accountants, or textile workers, while their male counterparts were celebrated annually with parades and honors. The Night Witches had become ghosts in their own country. For legends like Nadezhda Popova and Irina Sebrova, the transition was jarringly painful. They had commanded aircraft and made life-or-death decisions every night. Yet now they were treated like fragile porcelain dolls. Some tried to stay in aviation, but the commercial airlines and the military were closed to them, and the only flying jobs available were dangerous and low-paying crop-dusting roles. Many chose to walk away from flying entirely. Unable to bear the demotion from combat pilot to agricultural laborer, they traded the control stick for the chalk of a classroom or the pen of an office, grounding themselves in a life that felt grey and suffocating compared to the adrenaline of the front. Despite the silence imposed by society, the statistical legacy of the regiment remained an undeniable testament to their impact. Over the course of the war, the women of the 46th Guards Regiment had flown over 23,000 combat sorties, a number that eclipsed almost any other aviation unit in the entire conflict. They had dropped nearly 3,000 tons of bombs and 26,000 incendiary shells, destroying trains, warehouses, bridges, and fuel depots. But the most telling statistic was the human cost. They had lost 32 young women, sisters who would remain forever young in the photographs kept in shoeboxes under beds. 23 members of the regiment were awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest distinction the nation could bestow, though many received it posthumously. The physical toll of the war haunted the survivors long after the last bomb had been dropped. The years of flying in open cockpits in sub-zero temperatures had ravaged their bodies. Many suffered from chronic respiratory issues, joint pain, and nerve damage from the relentless vibration of the engines. They had aged prematurely, their youth consumed by the stress of combat and the harsh conditions of the front, yet they rarely complained, viewing these ailments as the price of admission for the history they had made. They bore their scars silently, much like they had borne the weight of the war, with a quiet dignity that baffled those who did not understand. It was not until the post-Stalin thaw of the 1960 seconds that the story of the Night Witches began to re-emerge from the shadows. Major Bershanskaya, ever the commander, worked tirelessly to locate her scattered swallows, organizing reunions in Moscow on May 2nd every year. These gatherings became a sacred ritual, a time when the grey-haired women could wear their medals openly and speak the language of the sky again. They would meet at the Bolshoi Theatre, embracing each other with tears in their eyes, resurrecting the bond that time and distance had failed to break. It was during these reunions that the true magnitude of their sisterhood was revealed, a connection that transcended the war itself. As the decades passed, the historical narrative began to catch up with the reality of their achievements. Books were written, interviews were conducted, and the world slowly learned about the all-female regiment that had terrified the Nazis. The nickname Night Witches, once a slur shouted by terrified German infantrymen, was reclaimed as a badge of supreme honor. It came to symbolize not evil, but a relentless, terrifying justice delivered by those who were underestimated. The women who had been denied a place in the victory parade were finally given their chapter in the history books, ensuring that future generations would know that the sky had once belonged to them. The Polikarpov Po-2, the humble crop duster made of wood and canvas, also achieved a legendary status intertwined with the women who flew it. It remains the most produced biplane in aviation history, but its true legacy is not in its numbers, but in its unlikely combat record. It was a machine that had no business being on a modern battlefield, flown by pilots who had no business being soldiers according to the standards of the time. Together, the fragile plane and the determined women proved that technology and gender were irrelevant in the face of sheer, indomitable will. They turned a training aircraft into a weapon of strategic terror, challenging the very concept of air superiority. As the 21st century dawned, the last of the Night Witches began to pass away, taking their personal memories with them into the grave. Nadezhda Popova, one of the most famous and decorated pilots, lived until 2013, serving as a living bridge to that extraordinary past. With each passing, the regiment moved further from living memory and deeper into the realm of legend. Yet, their story refuses to fade. It is kept alive in films, songs, and the inspiration it provides to women in aviation and military service around the globe. They proved that the spirit of the warrior is not defined by biology, but by the courage to fly into the dark when others would stay on the ground. In the end, the story of the 588th is not just a war story. It is a testament to the human capacity to endure the impossible. If you listen closely on a quiet night, when the wind rustles through the trees, you might imagine the faint, whispering sound of canvas wings gliding overhead. It is the sound of the Night Witches, the silent guardians of the Eastern Front, continuing their eternal patrol. They came from the factories and the universities. They cut their hair and donned ill-fitting boots, and for 4 long, bloody years, they ruled the night. They were the sisters of the sky, and their flight never truly ended. It simply ascended into history.